judgment, end quote. Was that in part because of an opinion by the Department of Justice, Office of Legal Counsel, that a sitting president can't be charged with a crime?
Yes.
Director Mueller, at your May 29th, 2019 press conference, you explained that, quote, the opinion says that the Constitution requires a process other than the criminal justice system to formally accuse a sitting president of wrongdoing, end quote. That process other than the criminal justice system for accusing a president of wrongdoing, is that impeachment?
I'm not going to comment on that.
In your report, you also wrote that you did not want to, quote, potentially preempt constitutional processes for addressing presidential misconduct, end quote. For the non-lawyers in the room, what did you mean by, quote, potentially preempt constitutional processes? I'm
not going to try to explain that.
That actually is coming from page 1 of volume 2. In the footnote is the reference to this. What are those constitutional processes?
I think I heard you mention at least one.
Impeachment, correct?
I'm not going to comment.
Okay, that is one of the constitutional processes listed in the report in the footnote in volume 2. Your report documents the many ways the president sought to interfere with your investigation. And you state in your report on page 10, volume 2, that interfering with a congressional inquiry or investigation with corrupt intent can also constitute obstruction of justice.
True.
Well, the president has told us that he intends to fight all the subpoenas. His continued efforts to interfere with investigations of his potential misconduct certainly reinforce the importance of the process the Constitution requires to, quote, formally accuse a sitting president of wrongdoing, as you cited in the report. And this hearing has been very helpful to this committee as it exercises its constitutional duty to determine whether to recommend articles of impeachment against the president. I agree with you, Director Mueller, that we all have a vital role in holding this president accountable for his actions. More than that, I believe we in Congress have a duty to demand accountability and safeguard one of our nation's highest principles, that no one is above the law. From everything that I have heard you say here today, it's clear that anyone else would have been prosecuted based on the evidence available in your report. It now falls on us to hold President Trump accountable. Thank you for being here. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back.
Just a point of privilege, you and I agree.
Point of personal privilege.
I just want to thank the chairman. We did get in our time after this was first developed to us. We did both get in time. Our side got our 5 minutes in. Also, Mr. Mueller, thank you for being here. And I join the chairman and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Director Mueller, we thank you for attending today's hearing. Before we conclude, I ask everyone to please remain seated and quiet while the witness exits the room.
After 3 hours and 34 minutes of testimony, former special counsel Robert Mueller, most frequently in this time, pointing back to this 448-page report, often asking House members to repeat questions and specific citations, and kind of a halting staccato presentation that was at times pretty tough to follow. Before this hearing, the going line, as we've talked about from Democrats, was that they wanted Americans to, quote, see the movie to animate the Mueller report. But today, after this hearing, they may be saying the book is much better than the movie. Robert Mueller was clearly a reluctant witness. We now perhaps see why. He did say that the report did not exonerate President Trump, which was the most retweeted moment of this entire hearing. But there were several times where he contradicted what was in the report. One of the biggest was in this section of the hearing when he was asked by Democrat Congressman Ted Lieu if it wasn't for the Office of Legal Counsel guidance, would he have recommended an indictment of the President of the United States for obstruction of justice? Mueller said yes. The report says Mueller's team took the OLC guidance to mean they could never consider an indictment of the president, and the Attorney General says Mueller told him the OLC was not the only reason Mueller chose not to recommend an indictment, just guidance. He was called out on that by Congresswoman Debbie Lasko of Arizona. You know, this hearing focused on obstruction of justice. We're told the Intel Committee this afternoon will focus more on the Russia interference in Volume 1, but it was painful at times.
It was painful at times, and I think that OLC discrepancy is perhaps one of the, legally one of the most interesting moments that we watched unfold today. But, we also have to politically remember that the folks outside the room are really the ones who are most important in terms of what happens from here. Was there a winner today? Did Democrats win this? Did Republicans win this? Democrats, primarily Chairman Nadler, pushed very hard for this hearing. So he's going to be questioning himself, perhaps. Was it worth it? Did it enhance or detract from the argument that Mueller had laid breadcrumbs for them, and that it is now Congress's duty to follow those breadcrumbs where they lead, i.e. potentially impeachment proceedings or at least investigation? Are the American people going to be inclined to want to see more of this investigation after today? Or are they going to agree with a CBS poll that we put up earlier that said that 53% of Americans say that it's time to drop this, that it's time to move on? And what does Nancy Pelosi say when she watches this and she gathers with her members after all of this? Is she going to say, look, it's time to move on, or did they get what they wanted? What about the GOP? One of the things that they kept prodding at was whether or not Mueller had looked into the origins of this investigation. When it came to Steele, when it came to the dossier, when it came to all of that, he just kept saying, Fusion GPS, exactly. Glenn Simpson, out of my purview. That wasn't part of my investigation. So there were parts of that seemed to be obviously part of the report. But then when he was, when they tried to nail him down on some of those things, then it always seemed to fall outside of the purview. So a lot of questions remain here. And Catherine Herridge has been watching all of this along with us. And let's bring in Catherine from outside the Radburn hearing room this afternoon. Catherine.
Thanks, Martha, and good afternoon. The former special counsel Robert Mueller testified that he felt handcuffed by a Justice Department legal opinion that prohibits the indictment of a sitting president. And the key section of the exchange with the Democratic chairman Jerry Nadler came when he asked if the president could be indicted once he left office, and Robert Mueller responded, yes. But that's in conflict with testimony from the Attorney General William Barr earlier this year, who said that in March, Mueller told him and others who were on a conference call that there were evidence issues, that it was not this Justice Department legal opinion that was blocking his action. What we heard consistently from Democrats, they said to Mueller, anyone else would have been indicted on obstruction, except this is the President of the United States. But Mueller also testified that in no way was his investigation over the last 2 years ever blocked or impeded. Consistently, what we heard from Republicans is that there were double standards. Congressman John Radcliffe pressed Mueller on what Justice Department policy allowed him to make his decision and his statements on the issue of obstruction, that he did not exonerate the president, but they did not bring criminal charges. And Robert Mueller could not point to that policy because, as Radcliffe said, it does not exist. What we heard from Congressman Jim Jordan is that there was a double standard. He pressed the special counsel on this intelligence asset called Joseph Massoud, someone who started the ball rolling on the whole Russia investigation. And special counsel Mueller said that he could not answer that question. Jordan responded, multiple Trump campaign associates were prosecuted for lying to the special counsel, yet you say in your report that Massoud lied to the FBI, yet he was not prosecuted. Finally, there's an exchange that I think may go under the radar, but it caught my attention because it appeared to be an effort to possibly lay a trap for the special counsel. What I'm getting at is misleading special counsel Mueller about this meeting on May 16th, right before he was appointed, and whether he had interviewed to be FBI director with the president. He said no, he was in that meeting to provide input to become the FBI director, or who should be the FBI director. And then the critical question, he said, did you tell the vice president that this was the one job you would come back for? And the special counsel said, I do not recall. So that, I think, may be an important exchange going forward, Martha and Brett.
Catherine,
Thanks,
thank you. Democrat David Axelrod, senior advisor to President Obama, tweeted out at the end of this hearing, quote, "This is very, very painful." Let's bring in former independent counsel Ken Starr. He's also a Fox News contributor. Ken, you were mentioned a couple times in this hearing. Your thoughts on this day's testimony?
Well, one of the critical things, guys, is the very idea of Book 2 or Volume 2 on exoneration is very unfortunate. Bob Mueller should not have written Book 2. That came out very early on in the hearing. Congressman Radcliffe from Texas was extremely clear in saying, this is not your job. It's not just the focus on exoneration or not exoneration. It is the very idea that you're going to lay out all this evidence with no opportunity to respond on the part of the president, that is fundamentally not only unfair, and the fact that it's fundamentally unfair is why this kind of report that was read dramatically today over and over again is simply not appropriate. So I'm going to be very blunt. Bob Mueller did not give a good reason for why he wrote, and his staff wrote, the second volume, which is what this hearing was all about. The second volume, or the second part of his report, was on, quote, obstructive acts. And then there is inconsistency with exactly what was the conclusion. And why did he not do what the prosecutor, what he was charged with doing? What he was charged with doing was to, in fact, make a determination of whether there was a chargeable offense. And of course, he failed to do that. And I think that's been frustrating. It should be frustrating to everyone, but it was certainly frustrating to Attorney General Barr, who said, well, that's what you were hired to do. Let the record also show that in terms of the whole obstruction of justice and anyone else would have been charged, that is just wrong. There are prosecutors who would say, hey, given this evidence, which is untested, right? These are just allegations. Given this body of evidence, anyone else would be charged. That is just wrong. And I would summon to the stand Rod Rosenstein, not just Bill Barr, but Rod Rosenstein made the judgment in consultation with career people in the Department of Justice that what has been, just accepting Book 2 or Volume 2 is true, that we would not charge this. This is not, does not rise to the obstruction of justice. I think something was really missing from today, and that is it came out once, and that is when I've studied the entire report. What cries out is how frustrated the President of the United States was, how upset he was. Now that was emphasized, right? But why was he upset? The missing thing was, I've done nothing wrong. I don't know the Russians. There was no collusion. There was no conspiracy and the like. And Book 1, the first part of the report, in fact, makes that very point, because we now know from Book 1, the first book on collusion, that Bob Mueller concluded, based upon obviously some very sensitive sources, that Vladimir Putin was telling his oligarchs, we don't know Donald Trump. I'm obviously paraphrasing. We don't know Donald Trump. Do you guys, the oligarchs, do you guys know him? We don't know anyone in his campaign. So the whole idea, if we go back to the provenance of this, the origins of it, Carter Page never charged with a crime, and he should not have been charged with a crime. And it's the entire process has been so unfortunate that I think, to be honest, and I love Bob Mueller as a human being, as a patriot, but I think he's done a grave disservice to our country in the way he conducted this investigation. Now, by the way, he said time and again, I don't question politics of my staff. I understand that. But you aren't blind to what your staff members are all about as human beings. You don't ask them about it, but you don't have to ask to know that your Andrew Weissman types are very, very partisan in their outlook on life. Now, partisan people can put aside their partisanship, but it's a test. Can they? And what steps did Bob Mueller take to assure the American people that he had, shall I say, a fair and balanced staff? That was one thing I thought that was very revealing and missing.
Judge, a couple of quick things quickly. One is he was asked whether this, and it's different guidelines. You were an independent counsel. He's under special counsel, different rules. But this was supposed to be a confidential report to the Attorney General, and he made the decision with the DOJ of what happened next. He was asked, Mueller was today, whether he thought that this report would be public. He said no. He did not, in the report, recommend impeachment. Democrats, however, see this as a roadmap to impeachment. Right. He didn't talk about that today. Just your thoughts quickly on all of that.
Yeah, my thought is I have to disagree with Bob Mueller. When I read Volume 2, it was designed for Congress. He turned himself into an independent counsel with a reporting obligation to the Congress of the United States.
Ken, but as I turn to the panel here, you found, was it 13 charges of impeachment against Bill Clinton?
11.
Is that correct? 11.
Yeah, 11.
And so it's interesting, and let me go to the panel now. Andy McCarthy, it's interesting that Bob Mueller said, I don't want to talk about impeachment. Impeachment was not part of what I was, designed or in my purview. And yet, just interesting to note, when you go back to the Ken Starr investigation, there were 11 articles of impeachment found in that.
Yeah, I think not only that, but in his statement on May 29th, which I think he teed up for, to the extent he was trying to help the committee, he teed up impeachment for them better there than certainly he does in his report. He's very clear in saying in our system, it's not for federal prosecutors to be the ones to regulate misconduct by the president, that the Constitution has another vehicle for that and another level of responsibility. And it was clear that he was talking about impeachment.
Yeah. We're also joined by former House Oversight Committee Chairman and Fox News contributor Trey Gowdy, and of course Chris Wallace and Fox News Sunday. Mr. Chairman, your thoughts on the day?
Well, he said he didn't want to come, and now we know why he didn't want to come. I don't think the report should have been made public. I don't think he should have testified. Prosecutors don't engage in these collateral consequences like impeachment. You either indict or you shut up. The three main takeaways to me: Johnny Ratcliffe discussing the flipping of the burden. I mean, even the president is presumed innocent. So he's not above the law, which was the Democrat mantra, but he's also not beneath the law. Kenny Buck, another former federal prosecutor, said if you can reach a conclusion on conspiracy and collusion and say no indictment, then why couldn't you do it on obstruction? So the big takeaway to me was the Democrats wanted this to fuel their impeachment narrative, and I'll bet you if they could cancel this afternoon's HIPC hearing, they would.
Chris.
Well, this morning I had a kind of tough comment about the opening session. I think I may have used the word disaster. In any case, I had an email exchange after that with a member of the Democratic committee staff, very professional conversation, email exchange. And he said, look, we did not expect, I love this expression, we did not expect Robert Mueller to be, quote, the most expressive witness. That's an understatement. But we thought that in this exchange we could bring the report, the 448-page report, to life. And ultimately, I think this is less about legal issues than it is about political issues, because ultimately impeachment is a political decision by the House. And I really wonder after those 3+ hours whether or not they did bring it to life. There were certainly some moments. You had Jerry Nadler ask him, did you exonerate the president? No. Did you find there was no obstruction? No. The exchange with Ted Lieu, which may or may not have contradicted earlier things he said, where he basically said the reason I didn't indict was because of the Office of Legal Counsel ruling. But, the real question is this going to be a game changer? Is this going to change? We know there are 95 Democrats who've voted for impeachment, are a lot more now going to vote. And more importantly, Nancy Pelosi says, is there going to be some bipartisan to buy in on this? I don't see this changing many minds, and I don't see there any more move to impeachment. And to the degree that Nancy Pelosi really doesn't want to go down that route, she may end up unintentionally being the big winner today, because I don't think that the drive for impeachment gained any momentum. In fact, it may have lost some.
Trey Gowdy, as you watch this back and forth, very difficult moments there for the questioners who worked on these questions, and then you've got Robert Mueller in many cases, just starting at point A. Can you please rephrase the question? Is there anything that you would do in this situation as you look towards this afternoon to try to make this a little bit more fruitful?
More leading questions, more questions where he just says yes or no, and he's going to have to get better on the purview question. To argue that the Trump Tower meeting is in his purview, but meetings hours before and hours after are not, is a weakness that he's just never been able to overcome. That and the bias. If you fired Peter Strzok because of an appearance of bias, but you kept people who showed up for what they'd hoped to be a victory party, and you kept people who donated to Secretary Clinton, you got to reconcile how much bias is too much and how much of it is okay. So this afternoon, if Adam Schiff can't cancel it, which is what he'd like to do, more leading questions, less Mueller, and more, and Schiff's good at that. He's good at making the focus the question and not the answer, and that's what he's going to do.
You said many times that Adam Schiff said that there is evidence of collusion. So do you expect Adam Schiff to press him on that?
No, ma'am, because the three-eyed raven, Adam Schiff, saw collusion that no one has seen, not the House intel, not Senate intel, and now not Mueller. So he hopes that we will not remember what he said in March of 2017. They're going all obstruction. There is no conspiracy, no collusion. This is all obstruction. And
you don't think we'll get into Russia, specifically what they did or didn't do in the intel hearing?
I think that was the ruse to get Mueller to come back, that election security is really important, what Russia did, but based on the answers I heard this morning, he's not going to be able to help them very much. Politically, it needs to be obstruction. They lose on collusion.
Last thing, Andy, you had a Democratic lawmaker at the end of this hearing trying to shore up the resume of Special Counsel Mueller, asking him what president appointed him U.S. attorney.
Yeah. And he couldn't remember. And, look, the big issue, or one of the big issues coming in here, was Attorney General Barr had said that Mueller told him on March 5th, when they first sat down to have their first meeting about this, that the Office of Legal Counsel guidance that says you can't indict a sitting president had nothing to do with his determination of the case. 2 weeks later, he files the report, and of course he's relying on it in a big way. And what a lot of people said was, how could these two things be true? I think if you watch Mueller for 3 hours today, those two things could absolutely be true.
In other words, the staff drove the train.
I think 2 weeks earlier, maybe he didn't know what the role of the OLC guidance was, and by the time they filed the report, they briefed him on the change.
Panel, thank you very much. We have an afternoon of coverage with the House Intelligence Committee. We're going to hand over now to Outnumbered in just a bit. They've been watching along with us. We'll be back for the House Intel Committee hearing. Harris, over to you.
Martha, Brett, thank you very much. We are now awaiting former Special Counsel Robert Mueller's testimony before the House Intel Committee, as Brett just said. And he just completed his testimony before the House Judiciary. That ran approximately 3.5 hours, in which there were a slew of dramatic moments. Outnumbered now. I'm Harris Faulkner. Melissa Francis, co-anchor of America's Newsroom. Sandra Smith is back. Fox News contributor Emily Campagno. And in the center seat, you want Tom Dupree, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General under President George W. Bush. Let's quick go around and get everybody's first thoughts. Tom.
It has to be a huge disappointment today for the Democrats. They clearly wanted to bring the impeachment passions to a boil, and they didn't even achieve a low simmer. I think Mueller was surprisingly halting, surprisingly disconnected from his own investigation, and the points where the Democrats were clearly leading him to try to say he felt the president obstructed justice. Not only did Mueller refuse to agree with that, he affirmatively contradicted them and said, I just don't agree with that line of analysis.
Melissa.
I thought that we instantly knew why that day that he took to the podium and he didn't take any questions, and we were all surprised about that. I think we knew why today when we saw this. He had a really tough time answering the questions that he seemed to not know ahead of time. With Nadler, it was a different situation that looked rehearsed, but the rest of it, he was struggling, and it made it seem like he didn't know his own report. Maybe he didn't put it together. He didn't have, there were times that he was asking asked a question and I knew the answer from the report and he did not.
Like, what is Fusion GPS?
Right, exactly.
Didn't know. And much of the country that's involved in watching all of this would know. It's very odd, Sandra.
Fascinating reaction about Robert Mueller himself and his the way he appears, the way he has asked for questions to be repeated on multiple occasions. And it's coming from both sides of the aisle. David Axelrod, former advisor to former President Barack Obama, he is saying, this is a man that I deeply respect. He was tweeting during the hearing. He said he hasn't appeared publicly or testified publicly, Robert Mueller, in over 6 years. But he says he does not appear to be as sharp as he was then. Byron York, this is painful to watch. Mueller is slow to react. Our own Brit Hume saying Mueller's still struggling to answer questions even after they were repeated. So I don't know that Democrats or Republicans going into this saw Robert Mueller or even thought that that was going to be an element of this hearing, that Robert Mueller was struggling to really take on some of these questions and answer them.
You know, Emily, how is Mueller's credibility holding up at this point? You were making some comments as we were watching.
Right. I think that's what the Republicans have gone after. And frankly, it's been eroded. Now, I think the overarching theme that I saw today was this erosion of what we perceived as this commander of a 2-year investigation to kind of reduce to this feeble man that frankly had zero command of the report or the content, with a self-admission that it was a segmented investigation. So Republicans are pouncing on it. They're pouncing on the credibility both of him as well as the investigation because it's now an admitted staff-led investigation. They focus on the bias. Democrats, however, are focusing on the alleged attempts at obstruction and the but for the OLC report. But remember, there's a point of contention. The Mueller has testified but for the OLC report. We have that now. However, Barr, it was evidence, was the but for.
Real quickly, I want to get to Louis Gohmert because he had a go back and forth that was interesting. But I want to ask you about the point where, was it collusion, was it conspiracy, and that whole convoluted conversation that went on between Mueller and another lawmaker.
Yeah, that was interesting. I think what the point of that exchange was basically to try to rebut the president's tweets saying they found no collusion. And the point I think that they were trying to bring out at the hearing is that collusion as defined in the federal criminal code is not the offense, it's conspiracy. But I thought that the colloquy was fairly effective in showing that, look, when people speak colloquially in plain English, they often will say collusion, conspiracy. It pretty much means the same thing. I think that was the point of that little back and forth.
Okay, because it seemed like Mueller was saying that there was, at first they were kind of, as you say, colloquialism, kind of equal, but then legally not equal. I mean, it was really confusing.
Well, and that was one of the points where it seemed as though Mueller made a statement at the hearing that then when they directed him to what he wrote in the report, it contradicted what he just said. And it didn't match, and he didn't seem to acknowledge that there was a mismatch. And then he just kind of leaned back and said, well, I'll just rest on the report.
As journalists, we all just kind of look for inconsistencies. I mean, so we may not have your legal mind, but we know when something doesn't match.
Well, and you should know what's in the report. I think that's at the end of the day.
You and I were together when it broke. It now has artwork, mine. I've done some artwork on my 400.
Mine is dog-eared too. So.
All right. So Representative Louis Gohmert at one point was asking Mueller about having those anti-Trump lovers, the FBI agent and his paramour, on his team. Here's that exchange. Watch.
Peter Strzok hated Trump.
Okay.
You didn't know that before he was made part of your team. Is that what you're saying?
I did not know that.
All right. When did you first learn?
When we did find out, I acted swiftly to have him reassigned elsewhere in the FBI.
Well, there's some discussion about how swift that was. But when did you learn of the ongoing affair he was having with Lisa Page?
About the same time.
He's not corruptly acting in order to see that justice is done. What he's doing is not obstructing justice. He is pursuing justice. And the fact that you ran it out 2 years means you perpetuated injustice.
I take your question.
Talk to me, Tom. What was happening there?
Oh, wow. Well, I was interested in several things. One, that Mueller actually engaged on the question of did he know that he had someone on his team who harbored this deep bias? And number two, that Mueller, for all the talk in the report, and I think he sincerely believes about preserving the appearance of impropriety, he just seemed a little oblivious to the fact that he had this guy and Lisa Page on his team who clearly harbored bias. That's what's surprising to me, is that he says he recognizes the importance of appearing in no impropriety society, but at the same time, he wasn't taking the steps promptly to ensure that he would be free of that taint.
Yeah, and this comes back to something that Melissa is saying, and that has to do about not just his preparedness for today, but his actual involvement in the case. Look, we need to take a quick 1-minute break. When we come back, counsel to the president, Jay Sekulow, has given a statement. I'll share it. Stay close.
President Trump is tearing our country apart. His trade wars are taxing American workers. His immigration policies are separating parents from their children. His crimes and corruption are threatening the rule of law. And his racist rhetoric is pitting Americans against each other. The Constitution is very clear. Congress has oversight over the president. So what's their response? They're going on vacation for 6 weeks. Seriously? We're in a crisis. That's why I'm asking Speaker Pelosi to cancel summer vacation and conduct daily public oversight hearings to hold Trump accountable for his crimes, corruption, and racism. Business as usual is not working for the American people. We need action now. I'm Tom Steyer, and I approve this message because we have to stand up to Donald Trump before he destroys our democracy. Join me. Together, we can change this.
We are back with live coverage today as we continue watching Robert Mueller. He's got a bit of a break right now before he faces the Intelligence Committee, which is chaired by Adam Schiff, an opportunity that they have all said they wanted for some time. But after some of the reviews have come in this morning of Mr. Mueller's performance, they may be questioning whether or not this is helping their case or not at this point.
Continuing coverage here on Fox News, our thanks to the Outnumbered crew. Harris teased that there is a new statement from the president's attorneys. Jay Sekulow, counsel to the president, says this, quote, "This morning's testimony exposed the troubling deficiencies of the special counsel's investigation. The testimony revealed that this probe was conducted by a small group of politically biased prosecutors who, as hard as they tried, were unable to establish either obstruction, conspiracy, or collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. It's also clear that the special counsel conducted his 2-year investigation unimpeded. The American people understand that this issue is over. They also understand the case is closed." Again, from the counsel to the president. We're back with Ken Starr, also our panel, and we have Chris Wallace, Andy McCarthy, and former House Oversight Committee Chairman and Fox News contributor Trey Gowdy. Judge Starr, let's start with you as we head to the House Intelligence Committee. The guess is that this is going to focus more on the Russia interference part of this. What are your thoughts on looking at what we've seen and what's ahead?
Well, I think that when we go back and analyze all that Bob Mueller, in a very thorough investigation that we have to admit, very thorough, very comprehensive, and essentially unimpeded, some quibbling about that there was, in fact, no collusion. It just did not happen. And again, when we go to the report itself and we see all these contraindications that there was any collusion, when we go to the 2 indictments of the Russian individuals and the Russian organizations, when you read all that and when you think about the cooperation of General Flynn, who's now in a different situation, out of all that, not a single suggestion of, quote, collusion. And the report, it seemed to me, in Book 1, not only was you have to tease this out, but the conclusion as you read the facts is no collusion or no conspiracy, and lots of contraindications. That is to say, not only was there not significant evidence of collusion, there was lots of contrary evidence that is suggesting exactly the opposite, including those 2 indictments. The 2 indictments of the Russian individuals, the Russian organization, cry out, no collusion. These are the Russian operatives taking their active measures, doing what they can to sow seeds of mischief and controversy within the American political system. But they're not doing it collaboratively with the Trump campaign or anyone associated with the Trump organization.
Trey Gowdy, one of the things the special counsel Mueller was tripped up on, the collusion conspiracy, and he said it's different. In the report, he said it's essentially the same. I asked about that early. But to the judge's point here, there were no indictments on conspiracy with the Russians. There were no indictments on obstruction of justice. Understanding the OLC guidance about the president, they could have indicted someone for obstruction of justice if there were indictments to be pushed forward, right?
I think Mueller did give the Democrats a little bit of an opening this morning. Republicans like to say no evidence. They like to set standards that the law doesn't recognize. Mueller corrected them and said insufficient evidence. And I'll bet you the Democrats are going to spend their time on that quantum between no and insufficient. And that could be up to 94%. I mean, the fact that you can't prove something beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean that there is no evidence. I'll bet you Schiff and Swalwell and the others talk about the evidence of collusion or conspiracy, even though it didn't result in an indictment.
Chris, politically, as the Democrats look at this, and we're going to talk to Tom Perez, the chair of the DNC, tonight on the story, how do they play this at this point? I mean, how do they gauge whether or not they should kind of close this book after today, or whether or not, as Trey points out, there's enough there to continue to sow these seeds, and will it be fruitful for them electorally?
Well, they're not going to close the book. And in fact, Nancy Pelosi issued a statement, I think it was yesterday, even before this hearing, that indicated that they're going to continue to investigate about these allegations, about allegations of other misdeeds by President Trump. And, you know, you can do a lot of things short of impeachment that can mobilize your base and maybe shift some persuadable voters over to your side by pointing out things that you say the president did wrong. So this will be part of the election campaign. I certainly don't think that you got any fuel today for impeachment. You know, to the degree that you had Robert Mueller saying things, he was simply ratifying what was already in the report. There was no new evidence from him. I just wanted to follow up on Congressman Gowdy. This was on page 2 of volume 1. I'm going to get some use out of this darn thing. This is what the special counsel concluded. The investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. Not saying not sufficient evidence. They're saying we did not establish that there was this conspiracy. So that's going to be a pretty tall hill for the Democrats to climb today. There was much more. I'm not going to evidence. I'm not going to say it's conclusive or evident that it's sufficient, but there was much more evidence on the obstruction front. There really is no evidence of a coordinated effort between the Trump campaign and the Russians to interfere in the election. There are contacts, but no sign of what they would consider.
Deal. I mean, that's the entire crux of this whole 2-year investigation, is this idea that, you know, and they brought up Roger Stone, they brought up WikiLeaks. What did the president know about it? Was there coordination? No coordination and no cooperation on the part of this campaign. Anyone or any American, they said, because the Americans that were indicted in this were indicted on separate issues, not related to collusion here.
And not including some of the people who, you know, they talked about, like Ms. Food, who lied to the investigators. And the beginning of this investigation, Andy McCarthy, is really what a lot of Republicans and a lot of viewers want to know, having looked at some of the question marks. This is not something Robert Mueller has been getting into. The IG and the other investigation.
Yeah, and this goes to there being so little evidence of collusion. I think the issue they started to try to home in on in the first hearing, and we'll hear more about today in the second hearing, is when did they know that they did not have a collusion case? It seemed to me that was one of the 2 areas, the OLC guidance being the other one, that Mueller seemed to have been prepped on.
And he had his assistant.
Yeah, Aaron Zebley actually interfered or tried to jump in on this question about timing. This is important, not just going to what Ken Starr had to say about, if you look at the Russia indictments, they seem to preclude the possibility of collusion. I would also point out that in September of 2017, they would have been due to go back to the FISA court to get a reauthorization of the warrant on Carter Page. That would have required them to reaffirm what they had been representing up till that point, which was essentially that the FBI believed that there was a collusive arrangement between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. They did not go back to the FISA court in September.
Trey Gowdy, you're one of the few people who've seen the unredacted FISA documents. You kind of have followed this from the very beginning. How much there is there going to be in this IG report and the Donovan report?
Well, you have to separate out the dossier from the origins of the Russia probe. I think in terms of the origins, in the early summer of 2016, I said it before on your show once, Martha, there was something for the Bureau to look into. Whether or not the Bureau planted that something and then looked into it, I hope Durham or Horowitz will tell us. The dossier never verified, vetted. A hard time believing they used that in a court proceeding. Looking into whether or not Russia was interfering in our 2016 election, there was a predicate for that. Andy was a much better prosecutor than I ever was, but what makes me nervous about when did you know there was no collusion is if Mueller is prepped, he's going to say, well, you only know when you interview the last witness, and we really wanted to talk to President Trump, and y'all wouldn't let us. If I were a Democrat, I'd spend a lot of time saying the guy that had a lot of the answers, you wouldn't let us talk to. And I didn't hear much of that this morning.
Which, in fact, you did when you had the opportunity with Hillary Clinton, bring it up again and again. The way that she was interviewed, that it was, sort of under very different circumstances. But as we know, President Trump never provided that opportunity for them at all. And that's certainly something that they could be probably pounding a lot more.
Ken Starr, we're seeing Bob Mueller under the spotlight. He, as we've said, has appeared before Congress some 90 times in his career. Senator John Kennedy, just a little bit ago, said, I just find the whole thing sad. I see it as one big anticlimax. Bob Mueller has served this country well and honorably, and I hope this isn't the American people's last memory of him.
That's a very fair comment. I served alongside Bob Mueller during President Bush 41, and I will tell you this, he was Semper Fi, a person of integrity, ability, but an enormous amount of energy. Obviously, he was going to be cautious today in what he said, but this was not Bob's finest hour, and so I agree with that sentiment that we should be grateful for all that he's done to the country, but it would seem today that he was not in command and control of what his office produced, and it's both a tragedy, but it's also been a disaster for the country.
Chris, as you're a Democrat sitting on this panel and you've just watched the last 3.5 hours, what are you thinking?
Well, I'm gonna go with Trey Gowdy, which is that sounds like pretty good stuff. I mean, first of all, you can't expect or rely on Bob Mueller to save your bacon. You're going to have to, we were talking about before, ask very leading questions and try to get a yes or a no out of him. He seemed better to me in the second half of the session than the first half.
Especially when his people were under attack. He seemed to kind of perk up.
He seemed to come up. But I would think that the Democrats would be very careful and would, to the degree that they can, say things that are on the record in the report and then get him to affirm that they're in the report rather than relying on him to lead the way. I don't see much of that going on today.
It's interesting when you look at the collusion side of the equation. You were saying, Trey, that obstruction is sort of the more fertile ground when it comes to this investigation. However, with regard to collusion, the other side of the equation is pretty rich. I mean, when you start to look at how all of this got laid out, the collusion, the meetings that happened with Professor Mifsud, why wasn't he investigated? Why didn't they look into is he Western intelligence or is he Russian intelligence? And why was it a gloves off relationship with Joseph Mifsud? You think about Alexander Downer also, who was putting out these little, sort of feelers for Papadopoulos, for Carter Page along the way. I mean, I would imagine that the folks on your side of the aisle are going to have quite a few questions about that, and perhaps the non-answers from Mueller will speak volumes there.
He's going to say that's not in his purview. Kenny Buck, former federal prosecutor, I love him. I wish he'd had an extra question because, the Democrat mantra was president's not above the law, no one's above the law, except apparently Professor Mifsud, who in the report you said lied to the FBI, and yet he's not charged. Flynn was, Papadopoulos was, Gates was. Why not him? So that's at least one person who's above the law. Kenny had a great line of questions. Think back to the Comey-Rogers hearing where this became public, where Comey confirmed the existence of a Russia investigation. Remember, Devin had a public hearing. 100 times Comey and Rogers said they couldn't answer. Think back to how Schiff and Swalwell and Himes handled that. They read the salacious headlines, and then knowing the witness could not answer it. All of the focus was on the question. All of the focus was on the member of Congress, and then you have this witness saying, I cannot answer. That's, I think, what you're going to see this afternoon. Adam knows this morning went terribly, or hopefully his staff told him. So he's going to be the focus, and the members of HPSC, the question will be what we're talking about in 3 hours and not the answer.
Andy, what we do know, and one of the most powerful things that perhaps Bob Mueller said, was a reiteration of the beginning of the report, and that is the systemic attacks by Russia, which likely will be a focus of this part.
Yeah, that's true, although, you know, he ran into a little bit of trouble because a federal judge gave the Justice Department a very hard time recently in one of the cases he brought because they didn't establish that there was strong evidence that the Russian regime, as opposed to Russians, were behind the propaganda effort.
As Bob Mueller enters the room, again, this is the House Intelligence Committee. Likely to be a different focus in the questioning. You saw the first round deal primarily with obstruction, likely to get more to the Russia side of this equation and how much Russia did or didn't do and what the Trump campaign did or didn't do. The photographer is taking position here, and we'll see an opening from the chairman, Adam Schiff.
It's also worth pointing out that Aaron Zemley is sworn in this half of the testimony this afternoon in this intelligence inquiry, and also that Adam Schiff is the chair. It's expected to go about 2 hours based on the number of questioners in this case, and we will see where this goes as we see Robert Mueller surrounded once again by photographers. Perhaps this will be one of his last days in the spotlight. He didn't want to do this at all in the first place, but he is doing his duty and has appeared today. He starts the second segment of all of this with Chairman Adam Schiff.
At the outset, and on behalf of my colleagues, I want to thank you, Special Counsel Mueller, for a lifetime of service to the country. Your report, for those who have taken the time to study it, is methodical, and it is devastating. For it tells the story of a foreign adversary's sweeping and systematic intervention in a close U.S. presidential election. That should be enough to deserve the attention of every American, as you well point out. But your report tells another story as well. For the story of the 2016 election is also a story about disloyalty to country, about greed, and about lies. Your investigation determined that the Trump campaign, including Donald Trump himself, knew that a foreign power was intervening in our election and welcomed it, built Russian meddling into their strategy, and used it. Disloyalty to country. Those are strong words, but how else are we to describe a presidential campaign which did not inform the authorities of a foreign offer of dirt on their opponent, which did not publicly shun it or turn it away, but which instead invited it, encouraged it, and made full use of it? That disloyalty may not have been criminal. Constrained by uncooperative witnesses, the destruction of documents, and the use of encrypted communications, your team was not able to establish each of the elements of the crime of conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt. So not a provable crime in any event. But I think maybe something worse. A crime is the violation of law written by Congress. But disloyalty to country violates the very oath of citizenship, our devotion to a core principle on which our nation was founded, that we, the people, and not some foreign power that wishes us ill, we decide who governs us. This is also a story about money, about greed and corruption, about the leadership of a campaign willing to compromise the nation's interest, not only to win, but to make money at the same time. About a campaign chairman indebted to pro-Russian interests who tried to use his position to clear his debts and make millions. About a national security advisor using his position to make money from still other foreign interests. And about a candidate trying to make more money than all of them put together through a real estate project that to him was worth a fortune, hundreds of millions of dollars, and the realization of a lifelong ambition, a Trump Tower in the heart of Moscow. a candidate who, in fact, viewed his whole campaign as the greatest infomercial in history. Donald Trump and his